Welcome back to Men and the City. In today's video, we're going to talk about the psyche of a mass movement. And this is the third part of a series that began with the Return of Kings and then moved to the Neo-Masculine movement. And this is going to piece it all together. Before I begin, I want to talk about what propels people to act or to change or to transform themselves. And ladies and gentlemen, the answer to that is emotion. It's not reason, it's not logic, it's not a mental understanding necessarily. It's feeling. And that feeling ultimately is what drives mass movements forward. Now, I want to begin with a couple quotes that are going to throw into sharp relief more precisely what I mean by feeling. And these come again from Eric Hoffer in his book, The True Believer, which I will link to below. A widespread enthusiasm or excitement is apparently needed for the realization of vast and rapid change. Members of a mass movement, and here I'm quoting him again, are attracted by the prospect of sudden and spectacular change, end quote. Now you'll notice that the recurring theme in those two quotes is the idea of change. Well, why would an individual or a group of individuals or a mass movement want change? They would want change if there's festering discontent. Now, most people, and correctly so, will tell you that nothing is going to change, or most people won't take action unless they're compelled to do so, either by coercion or because they're starving to death. And there's a lot of truth in those statements. But there's more going on in the human psyche, isn't there? If people are feeling discontented or they're alienated from society or they feel as though they're being subjugated or they're being discarded or their hard work isn't being rewarded, that creates a sense of frustration and depression that is intangible, to be sure, but it becomes cumulative in the psyche of the individual who feels it. It builds up over time, and ultimately it comes out. Now, the structure of a mass movement is one mechanism by which it comes out. And so I want to talk about how that happens. Well, let's begin with the leader. The leader is a man of personality. Man of personality is an interesting word. It's a term that Carl Jung used a great deal in a lot of his writing. Another term to describe this is a world historical individual, which is a term that Hegel used to describe people like Napoleon. But these personality types ultimately tap into a broader shift, a change, a permutation in the emotional temperament or distemperament of a given age within which they live. And they become the leaders of these movements as a result of that. They activate the underlying feelings that are already there. And they do so not just by understanding these feelings and these intuitions, but by giving voice to them. And I want to read a couple other quotes that I think are going to shed light on this. The leader allows us to express forbidden impulses and secret wishes. The leader wipes out fear and permits everyone to feel omnipotent. Now, those are two quotes attributed to Freud that come from a book called The Denial of Death. Again, I'll link to it below, but it was written by Ernest Becker. And Ernest Becker described the leader as almost casting a spell upon the people that he is leading. But that's not really what happens in the process. What happens is transference, and that's the next part of this. The leader is able to connect emotionally with this prevailing sentiment that he's giving voice to. Almost the way a parent and a child or a patient and a doctor coexist or cohabitate the same emotional space. In other words, there's a shared understanding, a shared emotional transference, but ultimately that transference becomes action. And that's what the leader really does. He gives action, or he gives voice to a particular idea or set of ideas that then translates into action. And he does this through something called the Initiatory Act. Again, that's discussed in the book that I'll link to below. What is the Initiatory Act? Well, the Initiatory Act tends to be whatever is that critical, pivotal action that compels everybody else to follow suit. In today's day and age, I would argue that the Initiatory Act is telling the truth. It's speaking truth to power. It's saying the things that everybody knows are true, but nobody dares say. Now, most of the time when you do that, all of a sudden your career is ended or your YouTube channel is demonetized, whatever the case may be. There are consequences that may be terminal for you, depending on the circumstances. But when these mana personalities come around, they tend to capitalize on a broad base, a mass frustration, such that when they utter the truth, it doesn't destroy them. It actually empowers them, and it begins to empower the mass movement that they represent. Hence, the structure of the mass movement that we're talking about, this mental evolution that happens over time. In the last video, I mentioned Martin Luther, and I mentioned the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther did not begin an upheaval against a corrupt Catholic Church. He was but one of many that voiced frustration and concern. He just came around at a time in which the rest of the population was savvy enough or aware enough of it that they could react. And of course, there were other circumstances that carried his message forward as well. So circumstances play a big role in all of this. But nonetheless, the bridgeway between the neo-masculine movement that I spoke about in the last video and the return of kings that I spoke about in the first video is the psychology of the mass movement. It's the psyche of the mass movement and its readiness for sudden and spectacular change. And I believe that we are on the precipice of that sudden and spectacular change, which is the motivation for these videos. So stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.